Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very, very special episode of the War Report. As we're recording this, it is the night of December 30th, 2020, which means we are less than 48 hours from 2021. And as we like to do every year on or around the new year, we want to give you a recap of the year. Now, 2018, 2019 were much, much less complex than this. Our 2018 show is very long because we got into a lot of details, which unfortunately, with how much we have to cover, we cannot do tonight, but don't worry, we still have plenty to talk about and plenty of details to get into. And just to give you an idea of what we're going to be doing, we're going to break this down into quarters of the year. We're going to do January to March, April to July, August to about October, November or so, and then November onwards. Yeah, give and take here. We'll bring up things as they're relevant, but again, we're generally going to follow quarters of the year. And without further ado, let's begin with the beginning of the year in January 2020, almost 11 months ago, almost 12 months ago, 11 months ago, whatever. So the first big story of the year was the assassination of Iranian General Soleimani, commander of the Irgc forces. That was on January 4th, 2020, and he was visiting a delegation in Iraq, and this was in light of the recent attacks on the U.S. Embassy and U.S. military positions in Iraq. So he was assassinated by a U.S. drone strike, which led to heavy, heavy tensions in the region. We moved a lot of equipment in there. A lot of people thought this is it, this is where the war is going to be. And funny enough, this was like right after John Bolton got out, so everyone was still breathing a sigh of relief from the previous September. But I guess they felt as they did that too soon. But ultimately, it didn't amount to much beyond like some wrist slapping because there were some Iranian attacks on a U.S. military base, which I believe that was January 7th, and then both leaders, both Trump and the Iranian government, sort of took a quote unquote off ramp. And this, of course, led to renewed tensions in the region, with Iraq actually voting to expel U.S. forces, which, of course, their vote didn't really get carried out. U.S. forces are still operating in this country to this day. They withdrew a significant number, though, same with the British, same with a lot of Western countries. But that was the first real big story of the year, and it is ironic because just as it happened then, it's coming around now. There's renewed tensions in the Gulf, which we will cover at the end of the show, sort of the wrapping up the end of the year with that. But just the year began the same way it's ending as we
hmm
speak. And of course, with our regular episode next week, we'll give you more of the details on that. But it was a hell of an opening to the year. Now, just to put this in perspective, I've said this throughout the show. I anticipate the 2020s as a decade to be very tumultuous. I knew we were one or two political crises away from dysfunction, and I think with the more obvious crisis of this year, certain disease that came out of China allegedly came out of some labs, whatever. The disease that cannot be spoke of, at least in too much of capacity. That really dominated the headlines this year. But I figured, like, yeah, come 2024, 2025, after Trump's presumably out of office, because this is when everyone thought Trump was still going to win re-election. Yeah, things are probably going to start to go downhill then. But I mean, I was floored after the Soleimani thing. Now, I was actually a bit surprised it didn't lead to further escalation. I didn't expect a full-scale war, but I figured that, yeah, things are probably going to get very nasty very fast. You can feel free to check out our episodes from the beginning of this year. I believe there you were on January. I believe we made the episode on January 4th because it was a couple days after the assassination, which was either on the second or the third. Which it was within that first few days of 2020. But like I said, it seems like it hasn't affected anything at all, and that Iran has actually gained even more of an upper hand between Syria and, with the course, the war in Yemen, with the recent crisis in Lebanon, which we'll also get to, and of course events in Iraq.
2020, you know, landed on a bad foot, and it has gone that way the entire year. From Soleimani's assassination to the emergence of COVID, um, to the re-emergence of ISIS and Deir ez-Zor in the desert in Syria. I mean, the amount of things that have happened, not to mention the BLM protests and Nagorno-Karabakh. I think in many ways, 2020, the amount of things that happen in 2020 sometimes take a decade to do. And you couldn't help but think that, that the way reactions to, let's say, COVID in general, although they didn't seem very scripted at the beginning, later on, it seemed like they had, let's say, a script for whether it was going to be just the flu or whether it was going to be something worse than that. And so, we saw that kind of perversion that you see in American politics for the last, well, it's been going on for quite some time, but in a very heightened sense, the last 3-4 years, particularly under Trump's administration, but to a lesser extent in the last years of Obama. So what I'm talking about is in the way that, initially all the Democrats wanted to say that this was just the flu. And, we saw Feinstein and Pelosi, de Blasio, and what's his name? Cuomo. There were other notable Democrats. So they kind of knew right away, like, this could be very bad because particularly in 2018, there was a push, for the migrants, the Central American migrants, particularly from Nicaragua, which to a great extent, Hillary and Obama are responsible for. So you could see how, that's a dynamic that they're used to. Ironically, the whole thing about voter fraud is that voter fraud, voter manipulation, first and foremost, is based on mass migration, mass immigration. That's the first and fundamental, because the voting habits of new migrants or immigrants is predictable. So that was kind of an interesting thing to watch. And then the script flipped, where now the Republicans were on the back foot saying that it was just a flu, and a very inopportune time, because I think the seminal moment came when we saw the death toll in northern Italy skyrocket, and eventually northern Italy itself became the first country to issue lockdowns in Europe, or in the greater idea of the West. The Anglosphere would be included in that as well. But yeah, the first 3 months, there were lots of, for me, there were lots of harbingers of worse things to come. And it didn't, if you parse out between good and bad, Soleimani getting killed was bad, but it didn't escalate. The fact that huge gains were made in the first quarter in Syria was a good thing. But then just a month and a half, 2 months, well, let's say 2 months later, we saw the reemergence of ISIS. And they're still on bombing campaigns. It was either today or yesterday that a convoy of buses filled with Syrian soldiers was attacked. They're estimating about 30 were killed. Some of them burned to death. This is in the campaign in Deir ez-Zor, in the sort of northeast central part of the country, below the Euphrates. And so I think it was, and I think the psychological impact of lockdowns is another thing to keep in mind. I find like the average normie is disturbed by this, right? In some ways, being who we are, I think has a kind of insulating effect where we're not we're not terribly surprised. I remember back in September saying there'll be another lockdown, and 2021 will have lockdowns, and they're going to find other strains. There'll be other reasons to have lockdowns. Uh, I've already seen some articles suggesting that maybe the flu needs to have some shots. Maybe like lockdowns, should be implemented not just for, let's say, biological, like biochemical health, in terms of viruses. But let's say that there's a terrorist attack. Maybe we should do a lockdown for that. I know some of these are outlandish, and there's a good portion that, in the foreseeable future are not going to be implemented. What I'm trying to say is that I think the taste of power has been quite something. And I think everybody kind of waited to see how compliant would the populations be. And generally, they've been pretty compliant. Like, there's been some resistance at some time during the year in various countries. Let's say Germany is one. But generally speaking, mostly compliant. That's understandable because early on, I think, the way things went in Italy was so dramatically different than what we knew or could be confirmed with China.
Yes,
But
because you had the very apocalyptic videos out of China, and then you got to Iran, and
right,
at that point on the show, I was saying, okay, Wuhan, China, southern China, poorer healthcare infrastructure, still like a second world country in those parts. It's not exactly like Beijing or Shanghai we're talking about. Iran, their healthcare industry is completely crippled by sanctions and other restrictions put on them to the point where not even their elites can get proper healthcare. But when it happened to a European country, that's when I started to get concerned when it happened to a first world country
right.
with proper healthcare infrastructure. Especially, it's not even like we're talking about like even some parts of southern Italy or other parts like southern Europe or like maybe the Balkans or Greece, whatever. We're talking about northern Italy, which is again a lot of people like to joke that it's just practically an extension of Germany and Switzerland, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And then you see the same thing in Spain, which is known for its better healthcare system, but when it got to places like France, Germany, and the UK, not that it wasn't bad, but compared to places like northern Italy and Spain, it didn't even look like the same disease.
Right. I think that was another shocker. And I remember back in April watching a YouTube channel. I think it was Red Pill Germany. And now, once in a blue moon, I'll catch one of his videos. But this one I made sure to watch. Someone had recommended it to me, and that was because they were compiling, uh, you know, total number of deaths per month and the records from 1920, from 2020 to 2017. So you could compare the three previous, each month and the three previous years and see what the death count was. And there was a death count. There was an inordinate amount of people who were dying, and they were dying in April and May. For many of these countries, maybe not so like where I'm from in Canada, but for many of these countries, they are outside of flu season. They've already been experiencing warmer temperatures for quite a few weeks ahead of us. So, I've never written it off as just the flu. Um, but I would say that I think that with the BLM protest, I think my mind was changed, um, particularly because you could see that there was a kind of effort to institute a new civic religion. Whereas before there was a sense of a nominal Christian religion, something that was quite prevalent in the U.S. for a long period of time. generally Protestant, but also nominal, and that was being replaced with a different religion, what we would call progressivism or wokeism or whatever. And you see this bearing out in other countries that are considered more or less part of the West, or are definitely very influenced by the U.S., or the U.S. plays a strong role, like in Argentina. So we saw today the legalization of abortion, and you see these women. I would say 25% are not even wearing masks or wearing them properly. Many of them have them down, and they're jumping for joy because now full on abortion for no reason is now possible. And so you see this kind of the march of progressivism continue. And I think 2020, I think also, as we approach the tail end, there were a lot of other things that I think it made me realize. And that was, we've often talked on this show about, how even Trump had to accept progressivist raison d'etres for American foreign intervention, like abortion. Sorry, well, besides abortion, but gay marriage must be legal everywhere in every country. That's a messianic mission of the U.S. But I want to just contrast that with the way America approached that in the 80s. The 90s was, and the early 2000s were generally a transitional period, but all the talk during Reagan's time was about liberty, right? And all the talk about foreign intervention is now about equality, right? And so this has been the bifurcation of American liberalism, or which is essential, part and parcel of America, or American Enlightenment, right? And before people say, well, America was a Christian nation, I get that, but its elites adhered to something else,
Yeah,
and
that's getting into the debate between is America the nation of the founding stock, or the nation of the I would say elites who created it.
right. What you can say is many of the elites were occultists. Some, a good portion were not, but
Yeah, they
many of them
just
had
just
a
just
little.
yeah, just generally, like, they range from lukewarm Protestants to like outright like ritualistic Freemasons. So it's
Right, right.
but
And then you have agnostics and generally for their time, the liberals of their time. Uh, like let's say Jefferson. Um, with respect to their time, and so you have this. You also, between founding stock and how you interpret the Constitution, you also have, like I say, the bifurcation of liberty and equality, right? And you can tell that during the Soviet era and the immediate aftermath, liberty is the number one uh, narrative.
yeah,
Mind you, the other one is never done away with wholesale. That's not the point. I'm talking about which one must lead. And so, with the USSR, of course, when in some countries at some time they had abortion rights, or the women worked, or there was a Women's Day, even though the culture by and large was still very conservative, much more conservative than, say, Western Europe, right? But what you led with was liberty, right?
yeah, and
What you're missing
you
is
actually
liberty.
touched on a point I've been talking about for a while now. I don't want to get on too much tangent, but that of Cold War nationalism, that rather than being a nation of founding stocks of like Anglo-American, to a lesser degree other Europeans such as Germanics, Italians, Eastern Europeans, whatever. The idea of a pioneer nation where you come here and you get a fresh start, becomes, we must be the, as Reagan said, shining city on a hill. And even though Reagan was, to his credit, at least a little bit more socially conservative than a lot of politicians at the time, it was about, we need to be freer than the communists. We need to have
Yes.
sexual liberation. We need I mean, you look at the advent of the new left. That was to pretty much defang the workers left, where they may have had more pro-Soviet sympathies. These people who are just normal working class people, but want greater pay or greater protections in the
Right.
workplace. It gets replaced by we need more liberalism. We need more women in the workforce. We need more abortion, birth control, etc. And that was the shift that took place in the left wing, whereas the right wing went from more the traditional stance to, again, being the strong arm that spreads liberty, which again manifested in neoconservatism, the hawkishness that was in the late Cold War through even today.
Right, and the important thing in in geopolitics, especially in times just prior to the war, is to set a narrative that strongly differentiates you from the enemy, right? And so it's interesting that during the Soviet era, that the great distinction that would mark the difference between these two opposing systems of governance and civilization would be freedom, right? But you can see with the fall of the Soviet Union that ultimately what that would mean for America is the value of liberty would then be decreased and the value of equality would have to be increased. Because, in a sense, its success is its obsolescence, right? There isn't any you can argue about China still being a communist country, but it is not communist in the way that it was a communist country in the 70s and 80s. And there are very few, if any, significant countries that still are.
Yeah, I mean, even the Soviet Union itself went from a what I would call a revolutionary terror state in the 1920s to a pretty just uh, pretty much a standard dictatorship throughout the 30s and onwards.
Right. So I think that was one of the things that I got a really clear picture of. I think a lot of people also got that clear picture of just the way sovereignty and hierarchy work within the US itself. Especially if you were a Trump supporter, especially if you wanted Trump to win, or whatever reasons you wanted Trump to win. Um, for a lot of us, we already knew that essentially, the blue party, the Democrats, are the permanent party, or they're the party closest to the permanent party. And a lot of things came to the fore. Uh, Everybody was astonished when the BLM protests occurred. Uh, there's lots of photos and videos out there if people really want to hunt them down. I'm talking about the first weekend after, George Floyd. So I'm talking about it right at the end of May and into the beginning of June. Not A lot of people are not wearing masks, and they're very close, and they're fighting. They're sweating. You see these pictures in the UK. You see them in Berlin. You see them in dozens of cities in the US. Um, and I was waiting to hear at least some condemnation, but it never occurred. You know, Even Fox didn't do one of its sort of hit pieces the way they do, like campus crazy liberals. Even they wouldn't go there.
Yeah,
So
and conservatives' favorite argument is pointing out hypocrisy. Now, granted, there was some of that, like the mainstream conservative political machine through their media outlets, which again, Fox News and like some online stuff, like whatever website Shapiro runs, that kind of stuff. Like, okay, you saw some of that, but like not nearly to the degree I would have expected. Not nearly that what they would have done for a Democrats are the real race or Democrats are the real homophobes, etc.
right, right. Yeah, that whole giving up the entire frame to your enemies so that you win a small point no one remembers. And of course, for any contrarian listening, I'm not saying this as if I don't recall people who stormed the Michigan government doors. You know, I mean, we are talking about several dozens of people, but we're not talking about thousands of people. And the fact of the matter is, all of them screamed that this was spreading the virus. And of course, when numbers for BLM I mean, literally, it was like 1,000 to 1 comparison. Nothing was said. Nothing ever was said. And I think it was at that time that I no longer. I don't know if I didn't take it seriously anymore. I just didn't care anymore. Because that's the messaging, you know. Like the COVID relief bill includes women's museums have to be constructed, and disclosure of spy agencies and the Pentagon of whatever information they have about UFOs. Like, I mean, obviously this is crazy, right? They don't take it seriously. Why am I obligated to take it seriously?
Well,
So
but they gave gender studies funding to Pakistan.
yeah,
See that's gonna counter the terrorism problem. That's gonna stop Al Qaeda and the Taliban right there. We solved the problem. Thank you, U.S. Congress.
yeah. So I mean, I think that the George Floyd riots really brought the impact of that whole spring to a completely new level. Um, and I don't think anybody was prepared to see it go on as long as it did. I mean, there were still significant protests happening from the very end of May all throughout to the end of August. And I think it wasn't really until end of August, September that many of them started dying down because it started to have a reverse effect. And you had a lot of journos basically saying that, well, this is it's not looking good for Biden. And of course, we remembered the ominous words. But I don't want to. I want to stick to the quarterly
Well, yes,
program. I have a habit
but
of wandering off.
this all did play into the initial COVID story. But I was actually just about to bring up to the oil bust
Yeah.
because this was one of the big stories that would have been big any other year, but got completely overshadowed by everything else. Now, this was in probably late May where oil just bottoms out. Late April, oil just completely bottoms out, starts hitting like a few dollars a barrel, starts hitting like a few cents a barrel, then into the negative price, getting up to like negative $19 by the end of it, before eventually just completely bouncing back. And this was almost completely between Saudi Arabia and Russia and the competition for oil production, and again, sort of a price war. And then one other element that really stuck out to me during this, in terms of the growing incompetence of the Western state and the Western government, is that Trump's hands were pretty much tied when it came to the American oil industry. He couldn't control their productions. He couldn't give marching orders to them like how Russia and Saudi Arabia can give to their state co-opted companies, even their private companies. The fact that the government has such an authority over such a strategic resource that they can manage it that way. While those powers technically do exist in the U.S., it'd be unfathomable for anyone to use them. Now, again, watching this all happen, and even beyond the president's ability to control, not even just Trump, but the president in general's ability to control that, the fact that this happened, this would have never happened, for example, in 2008 or 2010, when American global power was completely indisputable, when it was left unchallenged by virtually everyone, when we still lived in a pure unipolar world. Saudi Arabia would have never gotten this much out of hand. Russia would have never gotten this much out of hand. Especially Saudi Arabia, because if that would have happened under even an Obama presidency, like if Obama wanted that to stop, if Bush wanted that to stop, they could have gotten the whoever the king or prince of Saudi Arabia in charge of that industry is to stop it immediately. But they didn't. And I don't think it's because Trump didn't want it. I think it's honestly because he couldn't. Now, Trump had spent a lot of time early in his presidency garnering the favor of the Gulf states, which had less than the intended results. We'll get into some of the Israel peace deals in a little bit here, but it was just it was also just like a wake up call seeing that happen too, because we all knew that the U.S. was declining in power. We all knew that was facing new challenges, and that it didn't stand undisputed anymore. But watching that happen right in front of my eyes, like honestly, I
Yeah.
it was hilarious if anything, and I did enjoy the low gas prices. I'll say that much. But I mean, this threatened the world economy in many ways. Like this could have, if this would have kept up, it could have bottomed out Russia, could have bottomed out Saudi Arabia, bottomed out a lot of the Gulf states, Iran, etc. And
I think they would have been quite happy for that to happen. I think some of them were eagerly awaiting
oh
that.
yes, absolutely. And I think they were willing to sacrifice the domestic U.S. oil industry if it meant crippling those countries. But just like,
Absolutely.
and one other conclusion I came to, which again I don't have the quote unquote evidence to back this up, is that oil is actually an immensely abundant resource that they artificially control the production of to inflate its value, to give it. Because I'm not saying it'd be a cheap good, but it should be much cheaper than it is today, judging on how it seems like every time we're about to hit peak oil, they discover more, they drill more, whether that be in the U.S., whether that be in the Gulf, whether that be in Russia, whether that be wherever, Africa, Latin America, etc. That it just seems like there's a lot more oil than they're actually letting on.
Right, right. I kind of like, I did put on. I didn't really mention it to anybody, but and I don't think I mentioned it on the show, but I did kind of put on my conspiratorial beanie, and I did think like, what if this because I mean, let's face it, if any country had to print as much money that America does, even given like the incredible buying power, which by the way is going to be eclipsed by Asia eventually anyhow. But let's say if it were any other country that could you know just literally print more money every time they've run into an economic snag. um and again, notwithstanding, I know that many countries have American debt that they have agreed to subsidize for obvious benefits that come to them. But if it were any other country, and other countries are also have complex economic dynamics in their country, and if it were them, like this would be it. It would be over. You simply could not print this much money, right? You could not have such a powerful representation in the stock market. It just I don't see how that could happen. Like if it were any other country, printing this much money would literally give rise to like Weimar Germany.
Yeah, it's not even hypothetical. We've seen it. Look at Venezuela's currency. Look at Zimbabwe. Look at Belarus in the early 90s, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, when you had stacks upon stacks of money that translated to like 100 US, if even.
Right, right. And so none of that has happened. So you could kind of argue that if you wanted to sort of um, if you wanted to you know get a little conspiratorial, you could argue that maybe some of them planned this. Maybe some of them thought like, we could really damage China and Russia pretty badly if we just, if we. Um, but I know, I mean, it's way out there because the virus affected everybody. Um, it doesn't mean that it could have been some planning. I don't know. I mean, I'm just speculating.
It wouldn't be
I just
unheard of, especially with oil politics. Go back to the 70s if you want an example. It's not an
right.
exact translation, but the kind of convoluted schemes they would cook up, this sounds not too far out of the realm of possibility.
Yeah. So I mean, you know what I mean. There's a possibility, or maybe it's kind of like the whole COVID question in the first place. At first, you can tell that in January, February, they don't really know what to do. They don't really know how to handle this. But by March and early April, they have a much greater sense about what they're supposed to do, what's appropriate in terms of, what kind of relief packages are going to be made, what kind of lockdowns are going to be implemented, what is to be expected from this or that mayor or governor, and so on, right? But I think also by the time you get into the second quarter of the year, everybody knows what the impact is going to be. I would say at the end of the first quarter, you kind of got a sense, but I would say in the first third of the second quarter of 2020, that time around April, May, if you're fairly astute and you're interested in this kind of stuff, you know that this is going to be horrible. And you know that perhaps a second lockdown could wipe out all kinds of things. It's possible. Of course, money machine go burr, but how long can that be kept up?
Yeah,
And
and
we all know
even
that
with how long it can
unemployment.
be kept up, how much of that is going to you?
Right, right.
But with that being said, we did kind of cover we already kind of covered the Black Lives Matter stuff, so I suppose we did that in a little bit of a reverse order, which I suppose that would move us on to Belarus and the Caucasus, which were other really big overlooked stories this year that would have been probably given a lot more attention had a lot of other things didn't play out. I mean, even just down to the fact that it was an election year, and again, not even that was a normal election year, but even in a normal election year, a lot of this probably would have been ignored. But if this would have happened just a year prior, I think this would have been, at least in our circles, all over the front page. Now,
Oh, I think if COVID weren't here, I think this would have been front page for a very long time.
yeah,
I
especially,
think they
yeah.
would have, I think they would have gone to nearly the level of Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. They again, with that being said, I mean, they probably would have poured a lot more into it had it been a more viable option there. But to start with Belarus, they had their elections in August, and that, of course, was Lukashenko against Tinovskaya. Lukashenko got about what's his favorite number, 86% of the vote,
80
which if
or 84 or something like
yeah,
that.
something in the mid
Just,
80s, and
yeah.
while it may sound unbelievable on the surface, higher election approval than Putin gets in Russia. No, number one, I don't care. Number two, compared to the fact you had an old Soviet potato farm boss up against what could really just be described if she was born, I don't know, a few thousand miles west, she'd probably just be a cat lady blogger. Like, I mean,
It would be an awful.
I mean, she already is, but
Yeah, she's a Belarusian awful.
oh, that's a horrifying thought. Thank you for that, but it's not unbelievable that he won handily. Now, again, I doubt the current margins, but again, I don't care. So this led to a wave of protests throughout mid-August, which we discussed with our good friend Vile Varangian. You can find that episode from then. And the conclusion I think we all sort of came to was, yeah, Lukashenko has shown himself to be incompetent and be a fair weather friend of the Russians to the point where he frustrated what was once one of his main backers, and arguably still is his main backer, in exchange for Pompeo and that Western oil deal, along with Poland, along with all those other countries, really sticking it to the man there, and trying to play that both sides game that Erdogan does, where you pivot between the two poles that are closest to you. And it looks like they got Lukashenko to sign on to the energy deal and decided to do away with him. Now, at first, it looked like the protest may have genuinely been frustration with Lukashenko, that there may even have been a stronger pro-Russian element to it. But very quickly, it became the women are the future sort of protest, with Tinovskaya really becoming the face of the protest because, of course, she was running on behalf of her imprisoned husband, wasn't even running herself, and then of course, she fled to Lithuania and started promising days of reckoning every week, as I'm sure you'll all remember. This
Yeah,
was probably
girl boss.
like this was
It's a
probably
girl boss revolution.
oh yes, of course. But this was probably one of the stories I could actually have the most fun with this year because it was less macabre than a lot of the other stuff. Because I don't like to take this too seriously. I like to try to inject a little bit of humor and lightheartedness as much as you can in these sort of subjects. But it seems like this was the only one this year that didn't have the only major story this year that didn't have a massive toll, whether that be economically or in terms of just human lives or political stability. I mean, even you could say it threatened the political stability of Belarus, but I mean, guess where Lukashenko is today? He's still in power. He's allegedly going to step down in 2021, even though that's supposed to give way to more Russian influence in the country, which again, is the course most people would have expected, and even probably most people in these circles find desirable a reunion between the two. But you
Yeah, I mean, there were rumblings. If if we're going to talk about like the now the the third quarter, but there were already rumblings in the second quarter about something was going to happen in Belarus. Particularly Pompeo's visit in the spring. The deal that was drafted. Honestly, I was quite surprised that Belarus would do that. Of course, it came out much later that around this same time, the IMF proposed a loan to Lukashenko on the condition that he uh, go under lockdown. There are other caveats to this too. We shouldn't forget. Just to give you an example, when Romania, these are sort of the little details that get lost, right? So for us, it's easy to say, yeah, he had to do lockdown, and then he would get. There's more to it. So when Romania was accepted into the EU had a problem with the amount of monastics. These are Christian Orthodox monks and nuns. It had a problem with the amount of monastics in Romania. So it asked that the amount of monastics be reduced in order to be brought into the EU. Just think about that. Think how fundamentally you have to change your culture and your civilization, to do trade with these people. And
and I know
mind you,
it's going to be cliche, but imagine if they wanted to admit Turkey or Bosnia into the EU, and they said that about some sort of Islamic religious organization.
right, right. And to this day, Bosnia, is not going to be in the EU. So
Well, yeah, it can hardly keep itself together, but that's a subject for a different day.
I honestly think that some of the reasons are, one, Turkey has influence there, but that's not really the main reason. I think it is because they can handle a Muslim population, but it cannot have its own state within the greater body of the EU. I don't think so.
Yeah,
I
Bosnia
don't think
is a
I don't
divide
think they're
state, same
that.
with Albania, where that could be tolerable, whereas Turkey is completely off the table.
Yes. So what I'm saying is there were probably other. I wish I had spent more time on it, but there were probably other stipulations that Lukashenko had to follow besides the lockdown. But give in any case, the lockdown itself would have completely crippled the country economically. It would have set it up for a need for another loan, which is exactly what they want. So I was kind of surprised. I didn't think he was popular. Belarus was a country that I'd been following, off to the side, as it were, since like mid to late 2014. I would watch, various Russian pundits talk about Belarus. This was during the time of just after Maidan.
This is right
And
after Lukashenko tried to make himself the great compromiser between Russia and Ukraine with the Minsk agreements.
yes, yes. So there was speculation about foreign interference, and could something like that happen in Belarus? So it was interesting to see that all these, so it's a country that I was following, and it didn't turn out the way Ukraine did, thank God. Uh, I was still surprised, as I said earlier, about the embassy being opened up for the first time, the oil deal that was signed with Pompeo. Not good. This will compromise the country. Um, so that's Belarus. It would have been, as you said, a much bigger story had COVID never happened. It would have been front page and center, um, on a daily basis. But even the protests themselves are only confined to the weekends. No prominent politicians showed up. Certainly not from the U.S. There must have been some kind of stern warning, and then Lukashenko basically, just closed down like foreign media outlets. Like all of that was just, good for him. So that kind of the color revolution narrative was sort of, to an extent, nipped in the bud. It was not a complete victory. But Tikhanovskaya is going to be like a Guaido or a Navalny. She will most likely either never return or return many, many years later.
Yeah, that'll be. I mean, I imagine she'll, if if things play out the thing if they think the way they're going to. That was a struggle there, but if Belarus is integrated into Russia proper, which I think isn't unlikely, I think is a pretty good shot that that may happen. I can imagine her becoming some like Belarusian independence activist like in the West saying like free Belarus and that kind of stuff like and try to like turn it into like the Russian version like the free Taiwan or like free Hong Kong sort of movement that exists in the West like in response to China, but I could see that going, but that was one of two fires started on Russia's doorstep, and it seems like they very successfully maneuvered that one because, especially compared to the Caucasus one, which again, not that Russia didn't, I guess you could say, make out well in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, but it's early on. It seemed like the Belarusian protests were a little foreboding that Russia had lost yet another buffer state between it and the European Union slash NATO, like as it did with Ukraine, but it doesn't seem like it went that way. And I figured by like September it was going that way, but like I said early on with the protests, when it looked like Lukashenko was really on the tip of the iceberg, for example, when that video of him in the body armor with the with the rifle, that sort of one, like yeah, I thought things were going to get bad. Then I thought Belarus was actually going to turn to a pretty violent situation, but I mean, as we speak today, Lukashenko is just having himself a ball, no pun intended. Yeah. But just as an aside, there was a literal ball in Belarus today, like classic dancing waltzes, that kind of stuff, and it's something to really take in that the guy who started his career as a Soviet farm boss and had some marginal military experience and sort of goofed his way into power, I suppose you could say, has more of an appreciation for like classic Western culture than most graduates from places like Harvard, Yale, Oxford, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose the other big story of 2020 in August, let's say in the third quarter, was, of course, the protests had been going on. And we should mention that, at the beginning of the protests in the second quarter, we saw a police precinct go up in flames. And then not too long after, we saw the development of Chaz, where 4 people were shot and 2 died within like literally the first 3-4 weeks. I think even within the first 3 weeks, it was quietly dismantled. It became somehow to be seen a paragon of like what could be. I think all of us who are realistic knew it would be a total failure, and it was. And but you saw that dynamic between. It's a complex dynamic between the Blue Party activists with and also against the governors and the mayors. Like say Wheeler in Portland. So the governors and the mayors are generally on the side of the protesters, right? Like ultimately, the protests are really about unseating Trump. We speak about the Belarusian color revolution attempt, but there was a successful color revolution in America. And And even though it didn't oust Trump in some dramatic fashion, uh, the election did. But the sum total of everything that happened, you know, what it did is it drew support for Trump away, particularly from white men, and because he gained in every other demographic. Uh, Most surprisingly, 5% amongst Black Americans, but it was also other groups like Hispanics and Asians and white women and so on. So, anyway, in a sense, you know, his weakness, or his apparent weakness, was his downfall. But on the other hand, you know, the generals in office basically made claims that they would not support him. So when a Chaz was being developed in Washington, D.C., the National Guard would not budge. And so he had to depend on, you know, what is it, the Agency for Mail and Tobacco. He had all kinds of like state troopers that were assigned to the task. And of course, you know, I don't recall one instance where a protester was killed by police. Injured, yes, but there were no disappearances. Anybody who was thrown into one of those terrible fascist unmarked vans was released. Most of them before sunrise, and many of them before your restaurant that could serve you breakfast was open. So
Yeah, they spent less time than people do in the drunk tank. Just put it in perspective.
yeah. So you know, this was not Argentina in the 70s and 80s. You know, this was not some you know fascist takeover that people thought it would be. Of course, many journalists rooted on, hoping that that would happen, because that could be a way that Trump could lose everything without the necessity of going to an election. And the other big news that's tied in with the protests is, of course, Kenosha and Kyle Rittenhouse. And what, you know, to an extent, this was a big story. And it was particularly a big story because for me, the number one factor was how you had two different groups who like looked at the video footage, or some claimed they saw the footage. And one group said he went there to just murder left-wing activists. It's like they never even looked at the footage. Like, he's being pursued. He never once shot at somebody that wasn't already pursuing him or was trying to hurt him. The last person he shot drew a gun on him. Uh, but all of that wouldn't have happened if they had just let him run away in the first place. And I think this was kind of pivotal. For a while, it gave like, especially to Trump supporters, it gave like a kind of a shot. Like, I think it was encouraging.
Yeah, and
More or less.
even the conservative establishment media didn't throw him under the bus like they did with the Covington kids. It was pretty universal support for him. Now, in more recent weeks with some of the other stuff, not so much now. But when the initial incident, it seemed like there wasn't even like any like true conservatives who were like, I denounce this horrible violence or whatever they do like in these sort of things.
Yeah.
But with all that being said, you want to move on to the last big story of the third quarter?
Yeah, sure.
So, and this is arguably still an ongoing story because in late September, tensions over the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region flared up again, of course, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And there was no formal declaration of war by the Armenians. Now, the Azeris, on the other hand, they did. And I don't believe the Armenians actually sent any regular troops in. I believe they just sent in militias and volunteers and, again, sort of irregular forces because they weren't technically in a state of war. Whereas the Azeris sent in their proper military as well as the Turkish-backed forces that were given to them. And the Azeris, they were held off for the first few weeks, but after a certain point, they won handily to the point where on, I believe it was November 10th, November 9th and November 10th, they reached the peace treaty. And that did strip Armenia of some land. It was a blow to them. It did establish Russia as a peacekeeper in the region, especially in Nagorno Karabakh, where they did consider actually giving the residents their Russian citizenship, which we did briefly discuss on the show. But it was a coordinated effort by Turkey, by arguably the West at large. Now, you had condemnations from Trump saying, "Oh, those Armenians are fighting really hard." Like, I think he was like he was having a rally in some state with like some significant Armenian diaspora population, so he gave that speech there. I don't remember what exactly it was.
Mhm.
You had, of course, France. Yeah. You had France at least give some vocal support to the Armenians. Now, how much material support they received, that's another question of the whole. Most of the Western world stayed silent, stayed out of the conflict, and that pretty much led to a brief, I guess you could almost say, proxy war between Russia and Turkey, and you even had Iran briefly siding with the Armenians because of their fear of, honestly, I think Turkish-backed jihadists on their border. But Iran sort of like walked a tightrope. So did Russia, but Iran to a much more extent, having very large minority populations of both, and Russia having very strong economic ties to both, as well as significantly sized minority populations of both. Now, Russia actually, their supply planes were blocked by Georgia, were to the point where they had to fly them over the Caspian Sea through Iran to actually get to Armenia, and it was very bad for the Armenians. Now, I don't know the exact casualty numbers. I think they're still pretty heavily disputed, still up in the air. But I know one of the biggest problems they had was the drone attacks, where they would strap these drones for one use and have them fly directly into the target. And for example, what they do in Syria. Now, the difference in Syria, why these are much less deadly in Syria, is because of integrated air defenses with the Russians. Whenever they attack the Russian base, they get hit by the Russian air defenses. They get hit by Syrian air defenses in general. Whereas Armenia, as we discussed previously, under a Soros-backed color revolution government, had not integrated its air defense systems with Russian ones, as again you see in Syria, as you see in several other countries. I think, yeah, I think there's a few other post-Soviet states out there they have it with, or even how Iran does with Iraq now, with the point where the Iranians are coordinating their air defenses in Iraq, and they didn't even coordinate their air defense with Iran either, which seems much less likely given the circumstances of everything. But it was a nasty time for, especially Armenia, but for both sides, and it was a lackluster peace from an Armenian perspective, given to them again by a Soros-backed government. And what I don't mean to like stand and like brag and be like I was right about this, but what you saw there was you had Armenia backed into a corner. They had no choice but to accept this peace agreement. Russia came out really good on top of it, but you had these Western countries, these Western pundits saying, "Oh well, the entire world abandoned Armenia, and look, even Russia did, and they're profiting off it or whatever." While you had a lot of these same people who are fervent NATO supporters backing Turkey, which again indirectly backs the war against the Armenians, where as the push was, oh, Armenia should capitulate to the West like Georgia, like all these other countries, because Russia allegedly didn't help them enough, even though they had a government and a prime minister that was openly anti-Russia. And again,
Yeah.
the sort of narratives they always spin this way, and I don't know, it was probably one of the most disingenuous stories of the year within the first week that the peace agreement was reached, because it was all about like, oh, well, the world didn't do enough from Armenia. Oh, sure, I'm from a country that didn't do enough from Armenia. Sure, I'm in charge of government that didn't do enough from Armenia. But you know what? This is Russia's fault, not George Soros's fault, not Pashin's fault, not my fault. It's not Turkey's fault even. Turkey and Azerbaijan, the aggressors in this conflict, it's Russia's fault. It's Putler's fault.
Yeah, it's almost like it could have been really great if Europe actually had done something. I know there was a ruckus, within France over the lack of help, because Macron made overtures as well as Trump that he would help out the Armenians, but like nothing came to fruition. And France has a very large Armenian population. So politically speaking, Macron was savvy to say that, but nothing was going to come of it. And it really is hilarious. It's literally always Russia's fault for every misstep, every moment that there is a lack of political will to do something. If Russia capitalizes on it, Russia is terrible. But the fact of the matter is, Russia is very close to Armenia. It's not just the historical ties. Um, the relationship has been mixed, but generally speaking, good. And I think many Armenians feel like there really isn't another country that could ever defend them. Um, I don't cynically believe that Russia stayed out of this because it could foretell that it would have these bases. I think Russia,
Especially early on, I don't think the Russians are very pleased about having Turkish-backed fighters in a country that borders them.
right, right. No, I don't think so at all. And I think the world was stunned at the effectiveness of the drone warfare that was conducted by Azerbaijan and Turkey, right? With the aid of these sort of new kind of drones from Israel. Um, but
Oh yeah, I
it was more
completely
than that.
forgot that
The way that,
Israel had such a
well,
major role in this conflict.
what's that?
I almost completely forgot that Israel was the one providing a lot of these
Yeah,
drones.
that's right. That's right. Um, so uh, I don't I think Russia was going to come out with something because it's just historically it's always been in their backyard. So, and I don't think, um, I think the West stayed out of it. I think probably hoping that because I remember when the war broke out that Russia would commit a misstep and bungle things up and basically get the Armenian people against Russia, essentially, right? So the Russia blaming thing, I think, works nicely with the let's say the um, that Russia isn't going to defend Armenia.
Yeah, I think they were also very heavy on that, considering what had just happened in Belarus. Their absolute failure of a movement there. Maybe if Lukashenko was actually driven out of power and Belarus was Ukraine 2.0, they may have been less intense on this, or hell, maybe they would have been even more intense. Because again, you had those two simultaneous fires in Russia's backyard, and that was the end result of it. And this leads me sort of to my next story with Erdogan's audacity and his real show of force, and again, his butting of heads with Macron. The other two big stories in the third quarter of this year were Libya and Lebanon. Now, let's start with Lebanon since there's a lot less ground cover there. Now, in Lebanon, there of course was the massive explosion in Beirut, I believe on August 5th. Now, to this day, nobody knows what has caused it. There's speculation all around from a genuine accident to sabotage, but it brought the country to its knees in every sense of the word. Economically, it was already suffering from COVID, like every other country in the world. And then one of their biggest trading port on a coastal country is destroyed. Now, this is on top of the political crisis, the religious tensions in the country. Now, what you have almost immediately is Macron flies out to Lebanon to sort of establish himself as the protector, as the hero of the Lebanese people. I'm going to advocate for you, and we're going to aid you, and we're going to beat back this, and France is really going to reestablish its credibility on the world stage. Now, that didn't happen. Macron got 5 feet into the complex internal politics between the different religious groups and threw his hands up and went home. Now, to his credit, he didn't completely go with the Israeli-American line of we have to we have to hold Hezbollah accountable and they have to be restricted from this, and this. Despite being one of the most popular parties in the country, and just a surefire way to inflame tensions. He didn't go the full mile with that. He went a little bit of the way with that, but he went there. He tried to play emperor and it looks like he got frustrated, took his toys, and went home. And the state of Lebanon is really anyone's guess. It's completely up in the air. The country's been completely crippled. I expect, especially as COVID regulations will likely become less strict over the next year or so, a lot more emigration from Lebanon to, especially from the Christian populations, the more westernized populations, to the Western world. And again, very typically very skilled, very intelligent people. Now, they fall into the trap a lot of diaspora groups do with assimilating too well, if you will. And again, I don't think the future of that country bodes well. And again, it was a time for France to briefly put on some sort of image that they're a country worthy of being a power on the world stage. But I think they did a much better job in Libya, which we'll get to. But Lebanon made them look a bit pathetic in that sense.
Yeah, it didn't really pan out, did it? Like, uh, for a while, I thought maybe there was a possibility that Macron could have achieved something, but in the back of my mind, I thought like the only way he's going to push forward, obviously, is if he insists that essentially there's a path to remove Hezbollah from government altogether. And in a sense, that is what was being proposed. That uh, Hezbollah had to be investigated. That they couldn't have them, in the government. There were some countries, especially the U.S. and Israel, consider them a terrorist organization. Therefore, and I kind of knew when he went for Hezbollah first that this was not going to work. Right? This was an instance where if he had, like, there were two approaches. Either ignite the problems that come along with division by, let's say, appealing more to Christian Lebanese rather than Muslim Lebanese, maybe some liberal Muslim Lebanese, maybe, whatever. But he's not going to do that because that could flare up another war, another sectarian war. So the other method was, he's going to go hard on Libya because my principles, right? But that's not going to work because, as you've mentioned, their appeal is still incredibly strong. And, the war with Israel back in 2006 was essentially a war between Hezbollah and Israel, not so much Lebanon. Lebanon suffered for it, yes, and all parties had casualties for sure. But essentially, the war was between Israel and Hezbollah, and I think when I saw that, like when he couldn't find, let's say, a more diplomatic approach to eventually weaning Lebanon away from Hezbollah, you knew it wasn't serious. Um, you could well imagine, uh, certain projects that have a real vision behind them. Maybe some partnership and oil deals with Israel, like, let's say, finding new deposits in the Mediterranean, or um, I don't know, a new highway system or new ports, right? But he didn't use honey. They went right after Hezbollah, and I thought, no, this is not going to work. This will be rejected. And as we see, Lebanon is not even in the news anymore. Like, literally, one of the most dramatic explosions we've seen in years. And it was a miracle more people didn't die. And nothing. I think people in January probably won't even know for sure whether that happened in 2020 or 2019.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the things when I was recollecting stories for this year that I almost completely forgot about.
Yeah,
And
and it's understandable why.
yeah, I mean, like I said, these stories that would have been major otherwise had been overshadowed by COVID and the election. Those are the two big things that happened this year, and I wanted to gear the show specifically not to have those two topics dominate it. And I think we've done a pretty good job so far. We'll see once we get into the election stuff, but just to briefly touch on Libya, that was ongoing since 2019 between the LNA, which is led by Haftar's forces, and the technically UN-backed GNA, which was backed by Turkey and other various countries. Again, you had Egypt also become a rising star, so to speak, in this sort of theater where they wanted to intervene to prevent a Muslim Brotherhood government from rising, which it looks like Egypt really put their foot down, brought this conflict to a stalemate. Granted, it's been more or less of a stalemate ever since Haftar's health issues in May 2019 prevented really the LNA from pushing into Tripoli and ending this war once for all. Because I expect this war to be long over by now. If you had told me back in May 2019 that I'd be talking about it in my 2020 in review show, I wouldn't have believed you. I said, no, you're exaggerating. There's no way it's going to go on this long. But here we are, and Libya is one of those stories that will completely disappear from the news for months at a time, even on this show, where
Right.
it's because information is so scant about it. And like I said, I would have expected it to be long over by now. But the main conflict came down between the Turkish-backed forces and eventually the Russian-backed forces, with France stepping in on the LNA side. And this goes into the energy wars that were going on this year with the pipelines in the Mediterranean, whether Turkey should build them or whether it should be the Greek Cypriot Israeli project through the Palestinian, with even agreements with Egypt. Even Greece had agreements with Egypt over energy. So it boiled down to, again, this was quite literally the definition of an energy war. You want to talk about a war for oil? It's Libya right now.
Hmm. Yeah, most definitely. And as you mentioned earlier, this is an area where France has been more resolute, is willing to work with Russia behind the scenes, while Macron otherwise postures against Russia. Whether, let's say, it's Navalny, or he might have 2 cents about Nord Stream 2, although I haven't seen too much about that.
It's usually
Um,
Navalny and Belarus. There was the two big ones he was really
yeah,
anti-Russia on.
yes,
I mean, but
but
otherwise, it's been, as I remarked a few weeks ago, or maybe it was even last week, that still Macron and Putin have a better relationship than Trump and Putin, and that's also something you kind of sold me. That was development of last year, but it's still worth repeating, despite some dust ups, and then of course the Navalny thing was a weird thing because of how quickly it disappeared from the media to the point where, again, just to briefly address it, Navalny was allegedly poisoned. He was allowed to go get examined by German doctors, who, of course, said, "Oh, of course he was." And this is like, how many times has he been poisoned at this point?
yeah. And I love how the story has changed. He was poisoned at the restaurant, then poisoned on the train, then I think a motel room.
And then he went to Sergei
Now-
Skripal, and they got poisoned together.
Yes, 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 yes.
Oh, remember Skripal? That was almost 3 years ago at this point.
I know. I just love the story that they put the Novichok in his underwear.
Oh yes, yes.
What do they know about Navalny that we don't?
What do they know? And when will Navalny be speaking at the DNC? That's what I want to know. But with that being said, like I said, Libya is just one of those conflicts, I guess, that has staying power, and I think that's honestly because of how heavily the energy disputes are right now, and I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon because I think since it wasn't ended in May 2019, we're going to deal with it for yet another decade. Keep in mind, we're coming up on the 10th anniversary this upcoming year of Gaddafi being removed from power. It's been just over 9 years so far. It was October 2011, and we're coming up on 2021. So it's been almost a decade without Gaddafi, and the country is still arguably just as unstable as when he was first overthrown.
Yeah. I don't have anything else really about Macron that I could say. I think I will say this, however. As this year ends, I think a lot of the libs that they were admittedly so frustrated with Trump that McCain literally became a hero for these people. They looked at Macron, and you remember the handshakes, Macron's fierce handshakes that literally crushed Orange Hitler's small hands.
Oh yes.
Remember that? They thought like, oh my God, at least there's a resistance. Like as if neoliberalism is really in danger from fascism. It is really funny, and the other sort of change of mind that's happened just in the last days of 2020 is with Merkel. Merkel was heralded as the real leader of the Western world after Trump was elected.
Oh yes, those headlines from June 2017, right after she got the starburst chucked at her.
But what you have now is you have on Twitter there was like a pandemonium, you know, um, very EU centric journos and bloggers and just everyday people, left or right, were shocked by Merkel's decision to. I mean, it's essentially hers, right? But it's a EU effort. It is originating from Brussels, but a new trade deal with China, right? Now, the American side is looking at this as devastating. I think even some libs, but particularly right-wing Americans, are looking at this as devastating. Um, there's a sense of the writing is on the wall. But what Europe is doing, Europe is trying to really play off China versus America in order to create a better situation for itself, not unlike Erdogan, right? So, not unlike Hungary with Orban. You're just playing off one power against the other because you're a middle power or you're a little power, and you don't have very many options. So it's about. I mean, we've gone over this before. Anyhow, so I think there are opinions about these two in a sense have changed, and I think that the Biden administration, there's not going to be any enthusiasm for these two, for Biden or for Harris. Nobody honestly likes them.
Oh, yeah, and already France and Germany, it's let me pull up the maps. I'm pulling up the maps. You see those pink? They're pink on both the maps, and you know what? We're looking at the Biden presidency. So it's projected that France and Germany, either way, still want to pursue a more independent course. That's compared to a lot of these Eastern European countries that, ironically enough, want to strengthen ties, including Hungary. Who would have thought? But again, these are all projections. We don't know for sure how these countries would actually react because these are, again, this is just some think tank saying, I think this would happen, which, I tend to agree with a lot of what's being said here, but yeah, those are the obligatory mention of the maps right there. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you did have where in Europe for the longest time, among especially the leaders of Western Europe, it was supposed to be we, we're more American than you. We're more liberal than you. We're better at being Americans than you. Whereas you
Yeah,
have Macron especially, and now to a lesser degree Merkel more lagging along, saying, you know what, I think we want to pursue at least a more independent course. And
yeah,
that involves deals with China, even deals with Russia for that matter, and again, acting as an independent pole. Now, again, I think also an overarching theme just of this year is China's ascendancy. Now, China's been in rise for a while, but it's fully put a rest to the Hong Kong situation. It managed to at least stave off, if cover up. But point being, at least to the public eye, it managed to stave off COVID and return to quote unquote normal. Provided a lot of medical aid. Now, again, you can say that medical aid was of poorer quality or whatever. But point being is, if we're talking just pure optics, pure PR standpoint, China made out fantastically this year. And even, I don't know, depending on how responsible you hold them for the virus personally, you have to admit that they completely outmaneuvered the West in both a PR standpoint and just a realistic standpoint, from the point where they are doing better than them as a political system, despite their authoritarianism or repressiveness, if you will. They're projected to overtake the American economy by 2028. Now, economic projections are a fickle thing. They change just day to day, and this has been a projection for a while, but this is probably one of the more realistic projections, and we'll see how that goes, especially this trade deal and how the dynamics of Europe, East Asia, whatever play out. I don't know. Maybe China will run some sort of crisis that will collapse tomorrow. I doubt it. Maybe the United States will be able to regroup itself tomorrow. Maybe the United States will collapse tomorrow. Who knows? It's just one of it. There's too many possibilities to speculate to a great degree, but I think the 2028 predictions are probably the best they've ever been, so to speak. Probably the most accurate they've ever been, but it just goes back to the point where it was a complete outmaneuvering, and it seems
Mhm.
like as China performs better and better, the response from the West, especially the United States, isn't any sort of like real concrete action, any sort of things that we could actually use to benefit ourselves or counter China in a way that would actually make sense. For example, bringing back domestic industry, cutting some economic ties, or reasserting our own sovereignty, not protecting their oil trade from the Persian Gulf. But again, it just becomes more and more impotent that saying things like China lied, China cheated, we have to stand with Hong Kong, we have to stand with Taiwan. Again, as China grows into more and more of a formidable power, the response to China becomes less and less aggressive, ironically enough.
Right, and in a way, America was far too divided when all of these things coalesced. America was, let's say, America had the opportunity, if they had not been so fixated on Trump, to come up with some kind of a measure uh, in order to curtail China's rise.
Yeah, and just to touch on this, like the doctrine that Flynn put forward, Trump's first national security advisor, who is still, again, in the news here and there, is he going to get pardoned? Being dragged through the legal system. He presented probably one of the most rational doctrines for the preservation of American power. Now, it would have been a cut to American power. It would have been a retreat and a refortification, but it would have probably guaranteed an Anglo-American presence on the world stage for the next couple centuries at least.
Right. I mean, I don't know if America is capable of let's say, a 25-year plan for the reintroduction of industry within the
And
U.S.
that's exactly the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Those sort of plans, they sound great, but trying to implement them in a flawed democratic republican system we have, again, not referring to the parties, referring to the actual ideologies and government structure that, again, we're not Russia, we're not China with a more centralized autocratic government where those sort of decisions can be made. Not even that you need that kind of government make those decisions, but we've fallen so far off the path to the point where we can't even plan a quarter of a century in the future, let alone a century, to the point where sure that, like I said, there's all these great ideas that, yeah, by 2100 at least we'll still be a formidable power on the world stage. That didn't happen. And again, China's rise admittedly is impressive. I think Xi Jinping, all things considered, I'm not saying I like him or anything, let's just clarify that. My opinions on him, just completely aside, is objectively a good leader. He's taken his country to new heights. He represents his country well on the world stage, and he's an effective political operative on both a domestic and international level. Same with Erdogan. Same with Putin, and you could even say Macron to a degree. But you have all these things together, and I do think that China would have continued on a path of ascendancy had 2020 been a quote unquote normal year. But I do think just the absolute dysfunction within the United States has led to a rapid ascendancy.
Yes. And actually, as long as we're talking about Putin, and I guess we're not too far out of the third quarter, we should talk about Putin's draft of the new constitution
Oh
and the
yes,
new.
that happened this year and was implemented and was voted on.
And today he actually signed that any protests that are funded by foreign bodies will be deemed illegal.
Oh wow.
Sorry, Voice of America. Sorry, CIA. So,
Oh,
but
so that's why Navalny had to leave the country. He
new
qualified just as a human protest.
right. You're going to have to go really organic, like really organic, guys. So basically, what this means is, uh, the Constitution, not necessarily the law, but that fits in with the general direction of where Putin is taking Russia. He's isolating it from the West, right? So there isn't going to be any more integration. And you can understand Western Europe's power, even amongst liberals, because now, as China will develop even stronger ties within Europe, Russia will be its kind of geopolitical guarantor, like in that region.
Yeah, and down
Uh,
to the point where Russia said it won't do deals with the European Union anymore. Individual European states, yes, but the EU as a body, no.
that's right. So, um, and everybody, I think, fully understands the the dynamic between China and Russia. But just to get back to Putin, I have to say that he's made it very, very hard from now on for anyone to like, let's say the Russian fifth column, the Russian liberals, to upstage and turn around the kind of developments that he's put in place over the last 20 years. So, what I mean by that, we've gone over it, but just to recap, uh, you cannot you cannot even have a political office if if you're a dual citizen. If you live any extended period of time, you cannot become president of Russia. So it's creating a scenario where only those most loyal to Russia can commandeer Russia. And this is a country where, as you mentioned, it's more autocratic, it's more centralized power, and the person that you see at the top, he it's not all his, but he has a lot more of that power than what you see in Western nations, which are more managerial.
Like, yes, Putin has to work with the oligarchs. He is bound by certain restrictions, but he's not as much as a puppet as your average Western leader is to all these various interests.
Right. I mean, he has literally done things to defy them. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a more genuine power struggle in Russia and China for that matter, between the head of the party or head of the country and the various interests, the oligarchs, the business, the party apparatus, and then there is in America between the two quote unquote, democratically elected parties.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I don't know, I just think it's ironic that these ostensibly authoritarian regimes have honestly more of a political choice, if you will, than these other countries, and to the point where it's like the other criticism that's been thrown around a lot this year about the decline of America is that in places like Russia, China, and Iran, you know what you can and can't do. You know you can and can't say. Don't criticize Putin. Don't criticize Xi Jinping. But you're free to do most other things. Whereas in the West, it's a constantly shifting sort of minefield on what you can and cannot talk about. Something that's great and virtuous one day is completely evil the next, as we've seen. To the point where it's a very chaotic sort of dictatorship as
Yeah.
opposed to a stable one. And as I said the other day, democracy is just a dictatorship of bankers, lawyers, and school marms versus a traditional dictatorship of aristocrats, military men, and kings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, in the West, don't burn a pride flag. You could end up going to jail for over 15 years. That happened in the U.S. Or if you're unsure about the severity of COVID and you go to a hospital and you film, you know, the hospital in order to prove that there isn't, let's say a shortage of beds or whatever, that maybe in that town or city it's not as dire as it's implied. Well, you might get a tap at the door. If you make a joke on Twitter that's an off-color joke.
Yeah, not to mention the outsourcing, especially in the United States, where there are still technically First Amendment protections to the point where they just have private business do it to you. They shut down your bank accounts. They
Yeah.
blacklist you from using services. Social media is a big one where you have these people, even these pretty famous people like Alex Jones, who get banned from every mainstream website on the entire internet.
Hmm. Right. So, there's things. There are all sorts of things here that are just not permittable under any circumstance. So
Yeah, but I suppose we should move on. With that being said, to the last big story of the year, which we have covered ad nauseum, but I would still do believe deserves a brief
yeah.
sort of covering. That is, of course, the American election. Now, of course, Trump and Biden faced off. They had some pretty pathetic debates. They had only two of them because of COVID restrictions. Trump got COVID and recovered, etc. I think you all know the story by now.
Right.
And on election night, initially, it looked very good for Trump. Then Biden came out of nowhere and won it, of course, legitimately, because we would never imply that there was any sort of election fraud. But hypothetically, if there were, so to speak, there were very big spikes for Biden in several key swing states such as Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin. Funny enough, Trump gains in key swing states like Ohio and Florida, but he still manages to lose Arizona, Michigan, Georgia, technically, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I think on a hypothetical standpoint that is a bit strange, but of course this led to uh, long drawn out legal battles with various states, and of course all of Trump's lawyers. It's going to be any day now where Trump's going to overturn the results of this election and automatically win it, release the Kraken or whatever. I don't know what. To this day, I don't even know what that was all about. But apparently, Trump's lawyers had some big bombshell they were going to drop, and then of course the Electoral College met on December 14th and confirmed Biden's victory. Now the big holdout is the question like, will Congress be able to have this last ditch effort and correct the election results with some procedural issue in Congress on January 6th, which I don't think is going to happen. Admittedly, it could, but I think there's a slim chance. I think the time to challenge this was between November 3rd and December 14th, which, there was some effort, but I don't think there's nearly enough effort as there could have been. And, and that's not even criticism of Trump, but a criticism of the Republican Party establishment as a whole. There's plenty of criticism to be had about that with, Trump should just accept the results, despite the fact that a lot of people compared this to Bush Gore, where it's like, oh, Trump's gonna come out of nowhere with the Supreme Court. But again, this seemed like hypothetically at least a more coordinated effort towards that. And again, we've covered all this in more recent episodes, but it's just the grand finale for a year like this, isn't it?
It really is. I've never experienced a year like this ever. It's not. It really is incomparable. Uh, you know, I don't know. Maybe we should talk about because we have gone over the election. The election fraud. Notice now that even
The
CNN.
alleged hypothetical election fraud.
Well, actually, I have just seen them this week no longer say alleged voter fraud. Instead, what they say is there was no widespread voter fraud.
Okay. So
There was voter fraud. And, there's all the ins and outs. We know about the Supreme Court caving in with the Texas lawsuit. And we all know, that the voting, the counting stopped. Sorry, the counting stopped all around 9 o'clock, identical in all the 5 swing cities. Yes, I know that the suburbs unexpectedly voted more for Biden than the inner cities, probably because the inner cities had to deal with the fallout. And the countryside is almost always more conservative anyways. And so what you have this phenomenon where in previous years, the suburbs are kind of like this middle ground. Instead, what you have them is they're acting now as the center. Because in a sense, the center has been hollowed out. And maybe when we talk about what we expect in 2020, I'll get back to that point. But we've discussed this before. Part of me wants to delve into it again, but I won't. Albeit to say is I don't know the level of fraud. I know that there was fraud. we all know several of the cases, uh, like in Michigan and in Wisconsin, where we have vehicles showing up with hundreds of thousands of votes, all for Biden. Other ones, the fake pipe burst, we had to stop. Something was going on. One of the most unpopular politicians who failed in two previous presidential bids becomes the most popular winning American president in history. It's absurd.
Yeah, and
Right?
even beyond just population growth, that's still a ridiculous amount.
Ridiculous, right? I mean, even Trump gained slightly over 11 or 11 and a half million new supporters. And again, quite interesting. The only demographic he lost was white men. So, um, yeah, I honestly felt sorry for a lot of Trump supporters. Like you have all kinds of people saying, and it's true. Like they were like literally almost, in ecstasy as he drove by in his car on the way to the golf course. Right. I understand, how tenuous and how divided America is. He probably has advisors telling him, if you go out in public and speak, like in order to rally the crowd to like shift the election in a different way, somebody might shoot you. This is not, this is not hyperbole on my part, because you even had, generals, as I've mentioned over and over again, that refused to, who just said that even without President Trump, this country will still be united. We don't even need a president in order to remain united. And that, you know, uh, so I think he probably had advice telling him not to go out in public, that the potential for a loony is there. I think that was very real.
Even during the uprising and the unrest during the summer, he was. A lot of people were joking about how he was in a secure location in bunkers under the White House or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, listen, even during his campaign, you had that crazy dude who jumped on stage and he was found with a gun. He had like an Italian last name. He was a Bernie bro. He had some association with Antifa. I'm not saying he was an Antifa member or anything like that. Um, so from day one, it was already there. So yeah, at the end of the year, it was all about the election. Everything else got drowned out, and I think early on, I knew that they would never, never risk reversing this election, even if it took 6 months. And the, the apparatus for it isn't even there. Like you have three or four. How many did Trump appointed? Four, did he not?
Three
Four,
to the
three.
to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, to the Supreme Court. Um, all of them bailed on him. um, like there's no apparatus for it, right? If he did, even Fox News basically didn't support him. McConnell kind of didn't support him.
Even Mike Pence was wavering, which one of the
Yes,
biggest things one of the biggest reasons Trump allegedly chose him is because even if he doesn't agree, he is just a very loyal person by just his nature is what
right.
we were told at least. But even then,
Yeah. So you know, can you imagine? Suppose they're finding more and more evidence. The media would just go into hyper mode of disqualifying, the new counts if they were not turning out in their favor. And mind you, like these counts are not even proper audits because the envelopes can't be accounted for, or there's certain regulatory practices about and it's not across the board in all states. And this is why I think the argument that maybe there was a lot of voter fraud, but maybe it wasn't all staged, is because each state has a different way of doing it. They have a different method, and they have different regulations for mail-in ballots, right? For Pennsylvania, it was the first one. So I would say that there's nothing like no president can have a re-election based on a reversal of a electoral count if the media will not support it, and the media will not support it. So you always knew that was an impossibility, right? Again, 2020 taught us like the sharp differences between the people, the blue empire, the red empire, and perma government. And so we know now. We know, I think, more clearly than ever before.
Absolutely, and I think, as we've said previously, this is sort of the last semi-normal election. There will be the trust in the institutions is all but destroyed at this point, and with all that being said, I think we should move on to the last topic and bring this all full circle.
So Iran again.
Yeah, renewed tensions with Iran, with some gains in Syria. It seems like Syria is calming down in anticipation of a Biden presidency. So the most recent news out of Iran, of course, is the assassination of the scientist, which led to speculations whether it was the CIA, Israeli intelligence, whoever. Which, again, I think generally most people have come to the conclusion that it was an American op that took him out. But point being, this has led to renewed tensions, attacks on the U.S. embassy in Baghdad, flare-ups in Iraq, and the movement of American naval forces into the Persian Gulf from their normal stationing outside of it. That includes moved a few submarines, a few ships just in general, and it looks like they were quote-unquote preparing to strike, and we speculated whether there would be a parting shot by Trump towards the Iranians, which we both said probably unlikely. I still don't think it's likely. I think this is just one in the same. Watching what we're doing right now is what Trump has done throughout his presidency, and what Biden's response to Iran will likely be tough rhetoric with military maneuvers that ultimately doesn't really result in anything. But this is where we're standing at the end of the year on December 30th, 2020. By the time you watch this, it'll be December 31st. If a war starts tomorrow, I'll be floored, but just know that this will be some outdated information if that's the case.
Right. So, I think tensions are going to continue with Iran. Iran's ties with China are not going to decrease; they're going to increase. And just these last 4 years, because America did not have a kind of a sane approach to dealing with China. In a way, you could argue that the Dems, whatever criticisms they have of Trump, there are going to be problems if China does eclipse America. I just think they've already reconciled that with themselves and would rather not have trouble. They probably already foresee a certain role for America. It might be strictly symbolic. I don't know how that's going to, I don't want strictly symbolic, seems rather strong, but let's say more symbolic than usual, because America does depend on symbolic language. Everything from American exceptionalism to the city, the shining city on the hill, democracy, so on and so on. But, America was, in a sense, too divided and uncoordinated in order to deal with China. I think maybe if Trump hadn't been in office, or if the hysteria around had not occurred to the degree that it did, and there was some kind of cooperation, instead of a 24/7 dedication to the delegitimization of his presidency, they might have come up with a different plan, neither entirely Republican or Democrat, but flexible enough and strong enough that it could deal with China. to set new terms that wouldn't scare China right away and put it in a combative mode. Obviously, what we saw with Trump in office, that he actually did manage to cripple their economy to some degree. Now, it had negative consequences in some sectors of the American economy as well. And again, I think, judging the American economy is not an easy thing again, because they can print money in a way that any other country, if they did that, they would really suffer for it. But America doesn't seem to suffer for it. So,
What is it you said all the way back in 2018? In truth, the US dollar isn't backed by trust, it isn't backed by oil, but in
yeah,
truth, it's backed by the nuclear bomb.
yeah. Or what they're willing to do, their carriers, their whatnot, their military, their reach, and also the fact that they are the backbone to all the major trade routes in terms of being able to provide protection. That's still them. That's still essentially an American fleet. There are other players, but they're not remotely close to that of America.
We're nowhere near the 19th century in terms of multipolarity, at least at this point. Who knows what the future
No,
holds,
not
but
yet.
with all that being said, 2020, very calm and very uneventful year. I'm sure 2021 will promise to bring the same sort of calm and uneventfulness that this year gave us. But in all seriousness, again, I don't think this is anyone in this audience, but just in general, a lot of people thinking that 2020 is just this aberration. If there are any of you in this watching this right now, I hope we've shown you that 2020 was merely several beginnings to stories that have yet a long way to go, whether that be the Biden administration, the current political state in the U.S., whether that be the state of Europe with Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, etc., whether it be COVID or any of the Middle Eastern news or China, that yeah, a lot of things began this year, but a lot of things didn't wrap themselves up, and we're in for at least another decade of probably these stories. And for long-time viewers of the show, at least throughout this year, you'll notice that a lot of the episodes get very repetitive on a lot of news topics because there was just so much heavy focus on them. I mean, how many episodes in a row did we do about COVID? Like seven or eight?
Yeah, it's been quite a few.
Yeah, and
I
then
think I think maybe we should talk about what do we see happening in 2021. More of
okay,
the same. Good night, everybody.
okay, but yeah. With that being said, we can give speculations for 2021. Then I just have the one last thing I was telling you about before the show that
Sure.
I wanted to mention. Now for 2021, I think at least at the beginning we'll get some breathing room in both the domestic sense and international sense. Everything will calm down, go back to quote unquote normal for a while, but I think things will be right back on pace with 2020 come March, April of next year.
I definitely foresee more lockdowns. I see the possibility of lockdowns used really for other reasons, to become a mainstay, as basically as Western societies become more turbulent. Um, it won't just be about viruses and diseases. It'll be for all sorts of other things that might be deemed unsafe or hazardous, or that you're just not complying, and are endangering everyone else. I think we're also going to see a lot more breaking points. You're going to see more people who are going to reach their breaking point, and that has to have been factored in at this point. There's no way these governments, with their analytical abilities, could not foresee, like, maybe those people within the society that are going to be far more adversely affected, who already have mental health issues. I think we're going to see more of that. Um, yeah, so this isn't, these aren't going to be groups. These are going to be probably lone wolf attacks. People just basically losing it. And I mean, that's kind of a mainstay already. So I'm just talking about an increased intensity.
Oh, absolutely, and I really don't have much more to add to that. I think you put a pretty nice bow on that, so to speak. But the last thing I want to do here is okay. So you have the Time Person of the Year, and you even have the Africa World Person of the Year. Now, the Time Person of the Year, of course, were actually both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. The Africa World Person of the Year was Donald Trump. So I saw that today. But I think more important than both of those are, you know, the War Report Person of the Year. I want to start doing this now. This is gonna be one of those things I'm probably forget about by next year. But hey, so I have top three contenders, and in reverse order, I list them. And in third place, I believe we agreed, Emmanuel Macron for really the ascendancy of Europe as a semi-independent pole on the world stage, and really just his emperor LARP. It's been impressive to see, regardless. Now, that
I
being
mean, at times it's been just the LARP, but at other times it's been quite prophetic. I mean, back in 2018, he was talking about an EU army. Today, we have this massive economic deal with China. Brexit is going to happen. So he is ahead of the curve. He doesn't execute well. One would argue maybe there's not enough cooperation within the EU, but he's a good predictor of at least what strivings we're going to see. A lot of people laughed at his idea of an EU army, or that Europe might, go in a separate path. But that seems more and more likely now.
absolutely, which I think that is why he lands in spot number three. In spot number two, we have the president of China, Xi Jinping. Now, again, this goes to the fact that China saw a rapid ascendancy this year, as we were talking about, as they were able to at least maneuver their way or cover up their way through the virus crisis, through their ascendancy on the world stage, economically, their military advancements, and even their space travel advancements with their landing on the moon. That actually did happen this year. I don't think we got to cover that at all, actually, but there was that. And the reason I don't give China the number one spot is because I think there's still a lot that is unfinished there. I think there's still a lot that has to play out before I say China. Xi Jinping was the most pivotal person on the world stage this year. And again, I think he's in a fair number two spot because again, we'll see how that plays out. Maybe by 2021 he'll hold that spot. And number one, I'm going to give the audience 10 seconds to guess. So let's just count those down now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. President of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is our number one for the War Report Person of the Year. Now, the rationale we have here is really he's been just, like I said, probably one of the most pivotal people on the world stage this year, especially when it comes to the Middle East, especially when it comes to Caucasus. And just, again, as we talk about Turkey a lot, punching way above his weight, whether that be Russia, whether that be with the United States, whether that be with Europe, whether that be, again, even intervening in Syria and Libya without impunity, in the Caucasus without impunity. He has undisputably been probably the biggest power player this year. And as we were saying off air, while people like Xi Jinping and Putin, they do hold a lot of centralized power, there are still a lot of interests they have to balance in order to effectively wield their power. With Erdogan, what it looks like here, he has the raw support of the people and his party to the point where he can govern like a sultan would hundreds of years ago. And again, that goes back into the whole neo-Ottoman thing, which I do think is becoming more and more legitimate every day in terms of, wow, that actually is happening. But just the ability to project power on the world stage, I think, goes to Turkey and goes to Erdogan this year.
Yeah, I mean, maybe for me it's a slightly tighter race, but I would have to agree that if you look at everything that, because I think with Xi Jinping, it's a system, and his predecessors are as much responsible for the place that China finds itself after the last 30, 35, 40 years than himself, right? They've, you talk about avoiding a color revolution. In Hong Kong, well, how about Tiananmen Square, right? They managed to navigate that somehow. And we're going to see a lot of pressure on China with reference to the Uyghurs. This is going to literally become the 2024 Republican talking point for the 2024 election. It's going to be part of the platform, no doubt. What kind of mainstay it will have, I'm not sure. Um, so yeah, I agree with you because Erdogan ultimately has less resources and materials to work with. His country has a flagging economy that, like, again, it's been in bad shape for at least 3 years, but particularly bad this year. Part of that was COVID, but then everyone's economy has been affected by COVID. However, I
Turkey
don't think
is
it's
facing European Union sanctions with Trump
Mhm.
just a few days ago considering joining in on them. So
Right, right. And so his audacity, both in Syria and Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh, and now even wanting to go into Iraq, it's extraordinary, right? Like, uh, he just points at a Kurd and says, "I have to go there, and I'm building a military base to do it, in order to confront these people." And generally speaking, America has been compliant, extremely compliant. Um, to some extent, this also angers the Israelis. Um, he has disputes with Greece, another NATO ally, and so far he has managed to maneuver himself very well. A lot of things didn't turn out quite the way he had wanted. So Libya and Syria are two examples. Uh, there was no total victory, but he has a presence in both. And even Nagorno-Karabakh, what he envisioned, um, particularly say with the resettlement of Turkmen into that region, has now been halted by Azerbaijan itself. So I would say that, despite all that, you're not talking about like a really powerful country like China or America or even Russia, and he has managed to do many things that people were surprised. I don't think anybody could have predicted in 2016 that he would come back from this coup attempt and manage to get himself involved in so many projects. It could all flop. He could be considered like in 2021 he might turn out to be the loser of the year. We don't know, but so far he's managed to avoid catastrophe for several years now.
absolutely, and like I said, that's the reason I do give him this sort of person of the year spot because I think just his actions, maybe not on like a broad scale. Maybe you could argue that somebody like Trump or somebody like Xi Jinping, their actions had something that would send worldwide ripples. But in terms of just raw expression of power and ascendancy, I still have to give it to Erdogan.
Yeah.
And with that being said, that is 2020 in review. We're pushing the 2 hour mark. That's up there with the 2018 review. So I hope for all of you who are still here, you've enjoyed it. I hope you all had a Merry Christmas. Hope you all have a Happy New Year coming up just in a few hours after this airs. So yeah, I mean, we got quite the year ahead of us in 2021. We'll see where this goes. We'll see how long our gracious hosts at YouTube still allow us to be here and what other options we may have with that. But so long as we can, we're still going to keep on chugging along with this. So it's been, I don't necessarily want to say great time. It's been a very interesting time, we'll say. So I suppose we'll see you guys next year. Yeah, that old joke. Tell me if you've heard that one before. And bye.
Take care, guys.